A thin wind wandered through the valley, a cold wind, as if it had slipped through the teeth of something unseen, leaving a faint vibration in the air with every passing breath. Night had not yet fallen, but the late afternoon light slid down the stone walls of the village like sand in an hourglass. Time itself seemed to be draining out of the sky. A narrow path climbed the hillside toward an abandoned house. The house everyone called the Throbbing House, not as a joke, as a warning. Nima, a young man newly returned from the city, buried his hands in his jacket pockets. His breath drew pale, trembling lines of mist in the cold air. He had lived in that house once, for only a few months, when he was 10. Then one night, something happened. Something silent inheritance. Everyone insisted he should abandon. He had come to understand why they were afraid, and why he had never stopped dreaming about the place. His shoes crunched softly across the damp gravel. In the hush of the evening, even that small sound felt too loud. And with every step uphill, the air grew colder, the silence heavier. Then, at last, the house appeared. A still, unmoving shape, yet somehow alive, rising among the brittle dead trees around it. The windows were half-open eyes, staring from within the darkness. The splintered roof was a crooked, indifferent grin. But what caught Nima's attention was not its shape. It was the rhythm. No sound, no movement, just a faint, steady tremor in the air itself. So subtle, the wooden steps of the porch groaned under his weight. Long, damp, aching groans, like something caught inside the wood, was stretching awake. A thick, moldy scent drifted out of the gaps in the planks. At the door, he stopped. The old rusted lock was still there, but the door itself was half open. His heart struck hard inside his chest. Maybe the wind pushed it open. Maybe someone had been here. Maybe. With 2 fingers, he nudged the door. It opened without resistance, revealing a darkness that felt like the mouth of a wet cave. The air inside was colder than outside, much colder. Nima stepped in, and the house breathed, not with a sound, not with a visible motion, but with a shift, a slight, unmistakable pressure in the air, as if the house sank into a thick, absolute silence. Except, not quite. Thump. Then, thump. Thump again, clearer now. And this time, without question, it came from upstairs. Nima pulled his hand from the wall. The wall was trembling, very softly, but in a rhythm. His voice quivered as he whispered, This This isn't a memory." He barely finished the sentence when a faint rustling crept down from the top of the staircase. A slow, dragging sound, like heavy fabric sliding across the floor. Not fast, not aggressive, just careful, almost polite. But its dry scrape clung to the silence like a warning. Nima looked up the stairs. The top was swallowed in complete darkness. The darkness at the top of the staircase didn't move. It didn't shift. It didn't breathe. But it waited. Nima felt it. A stillness so dense it pressed against his skin. The kind of stillness that belongs to something aware, something listening. He swallowed hard. The sound echoed too loudly inside his own head. For a long moment, he stood at the foot of the stairs, unable to lift his leg for the next step. The railing beside him was cold, colder than anything indoors should be. He brushed his fingertips along it and jerked his hand away. It was damp, not wet like water, wet like skin. He wiped his fingers on his pants, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Thump, 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 thump. The rhythm pulsed again, stronger now, as if acknowledging his presence. It came from directly above, somewhere beyond the landing. It accepted his weight silently, the way a held breath accepts a second one. He climbed. Halfway up, the air thickened. His ears popped lightly, a tiny pressure shift, like stepping into a sealed room or descending underwater. By the time he reached the top, even his heartbeat sounded muffled inside his chest. The hallway stretched before him, a long, narrow corridor, darker than it should have been. The windows at the far end were covered in something that wasn't dust. Something darker, like soot smeared by a giant, careless hand. A memory flickered. He didn't see it clearly. Just a flash of his 10-year-old self running down this hallway, crying, with someone behind him. No, he forced the thought away. He edged forward, each step slow, careful. His shoulders brushed against the walls. The corridor was narrower than he remembered, too narrow, almost as if the house had grown inward. The thumping grew stronger. It was slightly open, just like the front door. A soft draft slipped through the gap, cold, with a faint smell of iron. Not blood, exactly, but close. Nima pressed his fingertips to the door. It trembled beneath them. The rhythm was coming from the other side. Clear, steady, deliberate. He pushed gently. The door opened without sound. The room beyond was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No furniture, no curtains, no dust. Even the floor looked clean, as if someone had swept it recently. The only thing in the entire space was a patch of deeper darkness in the center of the room. a round stain that seemed to absorb the little remaining light. The thumping came from under that spot. Nima stepped inside. As soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the door behind him closed on its own. Softly, he faced the center of the room again. The stain pulsed, slowly, deeply, like a heartbeat. Thump, dump, 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 dump. The air around it trembled with each pulse. Dust on the floor shifted, vibrating, as though responding to a low, distant drum. Nima crouched down, breath held. The stain wasn't a stain. It was a hole. Very small, perfectly round, no wider than a coin. And from somewhere, impossibly far below it, from some cavern, or chamber, or throat inside the house, the heartbeat rose. His own pulse synced with it, unwillingly, like two pendulums falling into rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. He leaned closer. A warm breath, not cold this time, but warm, rose from the tiny opening and touched his face. Nima froze, only the part beneath the hole. The vibration traveled outward, slowly like ripples spreading through water. It reached the walls. The walls answered with a deep, low creak. Not wood shifting, but something stretching. The room tightened around him. And then, from beneath the house, from depths no foundation should have, something knocked. Once. A heavy, hollow knock, too deep, too slow, too alive. Nima stumbled back to his feet, breath shaking. The house wasn't just throbbing. It was waking up. The silence after the knock was worse than the knock itself. It stretched and stretched until it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for him to move first. Nima didn't. He couldn't. His legs were rigid, frozen by something deeper than fear. A recognition he couldn't fully understand. A sensation that he had been here before, in another time, another shape of memory, another version of himself. The floor trembled again. Not a thump, a shiver, a low vibration, spreading outward from the tiny hole, reaching his ankles with the gentleness of something testing him. Like fingers, feeling their way up. Nima backed toward the door. He gripped the handle and twisted. It didn't move. Not stuck, not locked, just refusing. As though the mechanism behind it wasn't metal at all, but a decision. He exhaled shakily and looked around. No. Whoosh. He pressed his palm against the wall. The wall pressed back, not violently, just enough for him to know it was aware of him. His breath hitched. No, he whispered, more to himself than to the house. No, this isn't happening. The floor interrupted him. A second knock, deeper, closer, like something enormous shifting below the boards. Nima staggered back toward the center of the room, eyes locked on the tiny hole. The darkness inside it felt bottomless, an ink that swallowed light instead of holding it. He crouched again, unable to stop himself. The breath rose from the hole once more, warm, steady. This time, the whisper was clearer. "You left." Nima felt the blood drain from his face. He fell to his knees, staring. A memory, one he had spent years avoiding, finally scraped against the door of his mind. A room, a scream, hands pulling, slower now, but unmistakable. He had been in this room before. He had listened to this sound before. And he had run. The whisper rose again, trembling with something that wasn't anger, but grief. "You left! You left! You left!" The walls throbbed gently with the words. Nima stepped back, shaking his head. "No, I didn't. I was a child. I don't even remember." The floor moved. Not a tremor, not a vibration. It shifted, as if something beneath it rolled closer to the surface, pressing upward with unhurried certainty. Boards creaked, not breaking, not cracking, but flexing, bending as though accommodating a new shape. The thumping stopped. The heartbeat went silent. The entire house held still. Then, slowly, a single fingertip emerged from the hole. Small, pale, human, pushing upward like a seedling breaking through soil. Then, another fingertip pressed through beside it. 2, then 3. All impossibly small. A child's hand. The hand pushed farther, trembling, searching, trying to pull itself upward through an opening far too small for anything to pass. But it tried. With slow, painful persistence, the whisper rose again from the darkness beneath. "Don't leave." Nima's knees buckled, because he finally remembered the night he fled this house, the night he heard cries beneath the floorboards, the night his mother grabbed him and dragged him out as the walls shook, and something below begged and begged and begged. He had left someone behind, or something, and it had never stopped calling his name. The hand pressed harder, fingers stretching, reaching toward him. The wood around the tiny hole began to crack. Hairline fractures for the house didn't throb anymore. It breathed, steady, slow, expectant. The whisper spoke a final time, no longer trembling, no longer weak, but certain. "You came back." For a long moment, nothing in the room moved. Not the walls, not the trembling plank beneath the small hand. Not even Nima. Especially not Nima. He stood pressed against the wall, fingers spread wide, as if he could hold himself in place by sheer force of will. The child's hand, pale, dust-coated, impossibly clean at the fingertips, kept pushing upward, slowly widening the cracks around the hole. like wood softened, not by pressure, but by permission. The sound it made was quiet, too quiet. Thin threads of wood snapping like tiny bones. Snap, snap, dot, 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 snap. Nima swallowed hard. "Stop," he whispered. He didn't know who he was speaking to. The hand, the thing below, or the version of himself who had once run away. The hand paused, only for a heartbeat. Then it curled, as if gripping the edge, shifted its weight upward. The whisper rose again, faint but certain. "Don't go." Nima shook his head violently. "No! I shouldn't be here! I shouldn't—" The boards bowed upward. A bulge spread beneath the floorboards, growing, swelling, as though a small body were trying to stand in a space far too tight to hold it. The crack widened enough for Nima to see the outline of a wrist, thin, unnaturally thin, and a forearm beneath it. Pressed against the dark, like a creature trapped under ice, he felt his vision blur, not from fear, from memory. He remembered the house breathing like this when he was little. He remembered the warmth of the floor. He remembered crying, and he remembered a voice, not a whisper, a sob, calling for him from under the boards as his mother dragged him outside. He had left someone behind. The floor rose again, this time enough to make dust fall from the ceiling. Searching, reaching toward his ankle, Nima jerked his leg back. "No," the whisper answered instantly. "You promised." His breath froze. Promised. He didn't remember promising anything, but the house did. The bulge beneath the floor suddenly dropped, a quick, fluid motion, as if the thing below had pulled back to gather strength. Silence. A silence so deep, Nima felt it pressing on his ribs. Then, bang! The entire floor slammed upward. Dust exploded into the air. Nima stumbled away from the cracking boards as a long fissure tore across the floor, splitting the room like a wound. The two small hands clawed at the opening, pulling, tearing, widening the gap with a strength that did not belong to a child. Nima stared, chest heaving. "Stop!" he shouted, voice cracking. "Please, don't!" The whisper rose one last. Nima felt his entire body collapse inward. His throat tightened, his knees buckled, because now, finally, he remembered. He had said those words. He had whispered them through the floorboards as he was dragged away, a sobbing child, making a promise he never understood. The crack split wider, and something began to climb through. The cracks had opened wide enough for Nima to see movement. Not the hands, not the arms, but the shape behind them. A small silhouette, curved forward, pushing against the narrow darkness, as if trying to pull the entire room down into it. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow, soft drifts. The wallpaper flexed like skin over something breathing. Nima could barely stand. His back slid down the wall, and he found himself sitting on the cold floor, knees trembling, hands useless at his sides. The small hands gripped the edges of the split floorboards and pulled again. Not violently, not desperately, but patiently. As if the one below knew there was no escape this time. The whisper rose a little stronger. "Help me!" Nima shut his eyes tightly. No, I can't." His voice cracked. "I didn't even know. I didn't understand." The child's hands shifted, pressing down, lifting a head into view. Not fully, just the outline. A small forehead, hair clumped with dust, a shape he almost recognized. Not because he remembered a face, but because he remembered a presence. Something warm, something that once clung to him in the way frightened children cling to each other. His lungs locked. The head rose a little more, enough for a pair of eyes to lift toward him from the shadows. They weren't glowing. They weren't empty. They were simply watching him. Soft, still, expectant. Nima felt the breath leave his body. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The child blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the words, as if waiting for something else. The floor beneath Nima shifted slightly, not violently, just enough to remind him that the house listened, that it always had. The small voice drifted upward again. "You came back, so take me out." Nima stared. "Take you out?" The floorboard gap widened at the words. A tiny, obedient response, as if granting him access to a choice he had once refused to make. A choice he didn't know how to live with. "Please," the voice whispered, and this time it wasn't anger or blame or longing. It was exhaustion. A child asking for help the only way it knew how. Nima crawled forward, shaking, barely breathing, every instinct screaming to run. But he didn't run. Not this time. He knelt beside the widening crack, close enough to feel the warm breath rising from below. The small hands loosened their grip, turning upward, open, waiting. Nima reached out. His fingertips hovered above the tiny palm, close enough to feel the faint tremble, close enough for the child beneath the floor to reach back. The house went silent, utterly still, as if holding its final breath. His hand moved the last inch, down toward the waiting child. And the moment their fingers touched, the floor exhaled. When their fingers met, the warmth was wrong. Not hot, not cold. Just familiar in the way a memory is familiar. Something half-lived, half-dreamed, half-feared. The tiny hand tightened around Nima's fingers with a gentleness that made him tremble. It wasn't pulling him down. It wasn't holding him in place. It was holding on the way a child holds a parent after a long, lonely wait. The floorboards shivered. Not violently, just a soft ripple. as though the entire room was waking up beneath his knees. Dust lifted from the surface as if carried by breath. Nima leaned closer to the opening. The child below looked up at him, eyes steady, unblinking, as if memorizing his face. Nima. The voice was barely a whisper, yet it threaded through the room with impossible clarity. He froze. Before he could speak, the hand squeezed again, a small, pleading pressure, and the whisper came, "Don't let go." "I won't," Nima said, almost automatically. His voice shook. "I'm right here." The crack widened slowly, obediently, as though Nima's voice itself was permission for the house to move. The head below rose a little higher, enough for the upper cheeks to show, but the shadows still clung to the rest of the face like something protective or possessive. Nima tightened his grip on the child's hand. "Come on," he whispered, his throat trembling. "I've got you. I won't leave again." The child shifted upward, pressing against the boards, trying to climb, but not strong enough. The floor groaned low, a deep, wooden sigh that vibrated through Nima's bones. And then, for the first time, the child's other hand released the floor and reached toward him, not to climb, but to touch his face. Small fingers brushed his cheek, a gay or collapse. His breath hitched. "Who are you?" he whispered. The child tilted their head, hair falling slightly aside, revealing the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not happy, but relieved. "You forgot me." The walls tightened around them, a creaking pressure, a slow contraction, as if the house reacted to those words with something like sorrow. "I didn't forget," Nima whispered, even though he knew he had. "I didn't mean to." The fingers on his cheek slid downward, resting lightly on his jaw, a surprisingly warm, steady touch. The child's voice rose again. "Then take me out, before it notices." Nima froze. Before what notices? But there was no answer. Not from the child, not from the house. Only a sound, faint, slow, deep, coming from somewhere far below the floorboards. A sound like something enormous, turning in its sleep. Nima gripped long enough for a shoulder to appear, a tiny shape struggling upward. And then, a sudden sharp breath rushed up through the crack, hot and heavy, not from the child. The child's eyes widened. It woke up. Dust exploded from between the boards as the floor below them began to shift in a slow, rising swell. Nima pulled harder, voice trembling. "Come on, please, come on!" The child clung to him, and beneath them, something enormous began climbing toward the surface. This story is over. I hope you have a good night's sleep.